Greetings and welcome to Chapter 5, Color, Part 2. Local color is an attribute of color, and it refers to the idea that color seen in bright light, for instance in a gallery or in direct sunlight, would show the true hues of the objects in question. So in this particular work by Audrey Flack, we see that the rose is red, the glass is blue. The colors are displayed as if seen in proper light. Optical color is another attribute of color, different from local color in that optical color shows how color changes depending on environmental conditions, lighting conditions, even distance. This painting by famous impressionist Claude Monet shows a view of the portal of the Rouen Cathedral in direct sunlight, a condition which displays its local color best because the light is quite strong and saturated. Monet painted many different views of the cathedral here, and he did it by renting an apartment across the square, and every 2 hours he would bring out a new canvas. So he would work on a canvas early in the morning, and then 2 hours later when the light had changed, he'd bring out a new canvas and work on that. And he rotated through these canvases for a series of days, even weeks, until he completed all the paintings, the same view of the cathedral, but with different lighting effects because of the different times of day. Here are two more views of the Rouen Cathedral by Monet. On the left, we see that the color is dominated by these cool, pale blues and purples, a little bit of light dancing on the top. This is early morning when the sun is just barely starting to tap the facade of the cathedral. On the right, we see a view late in the afternoon when the quality of light has changed to more of an orange, yellow, ochreish type of a color. But at the bottom of the piece, we start to see shadows creeping up on the bottom by the portal, and those shadows are more of a purple color. All three of these views of the same subject matter, but different conditions of light produce the sensation of optical color. Arbitrary color, like the name suggests, is when the artist makes color choices that absolutely do not reflect the local color of the subject matter at all. In fact, Matisse's choice of colors in this particular painting, The View of Collioure, was a rebellion against what the Academy of French Painting suggested were correct colors, accurately reflecting the visible reality of the subject. His color choices, along with some of his compatriots, André Derain and others, caused French critics to refer to Matisse and his buddies as les fauves, which is a derisive French term which means wild beasts. This next section talks about different color schemes. Color schemes are employed by artists in order to reflect particular sensations or emotions, perhaps, that they want to appear in the work. Our first color scheme is the monochromatic. It refers to mono being one and chroma being color, so hence one color in this particular scheme. In this work by Keith Edmeyer, we're tempted to look at it and say, but wait, I see red and I see pink, so isn't that two colors? Actually, no. Pink is a tint of red, a version of red. It's just red that's had white added to it. Bear in mind, though, subtle variations in color usually will still be labeled as a monochromatic color scheme. This work by Yves Klein is absolutely a monochromatic work. The blue chosen by Klein, which he uses in many of his works, became so identified with the artist that it was trademarked as Yves Klein blue. Ironically, the term monochromatic, which remember means one color, is also applied to works that are achromatic, without color. So oftentimes when looking at photography or drawing, we see that art historians will refer to these works as monochromatic. Next on our list is the analogous color scheme. It refers to schemes that utilize colors in a narrow range located near each other on the color wheel. In this particular painting by Mark Messersmith, we see that the composition is dominated by colors on the cool side, blues, greens, even sneaking into the yellows a little bit. Because colors in an analogous scheme are located close to each other on the wheel, oftentimes we say that they produce a sense of harmony. They're like good neighbors that get along and play nicely. In the previous slide, we saw an analogous color scheme that was in this range here, dipping into yellows a bit, through the greens, blue, and perhaps even a little bit to the blue violets. So the range of the colors are through this slice, this section here, which represents less than half of the color wheel. This is typically about as much of a slice of the pie as you can take and still call it analogous. A warm analogous color scheme might also start in yellow, but move the other direction through oranges, even as far as red and perhaps into red-violet through here, a similar slice of pie. Sometimes an analogous scheme might operate in an extremely limited range, just blue to violet in between a primary to a secondary, and that's it. Here's our man Vince's painting of his mom in green. He painted his mom in green, and I'm sure she was thrilled. At first blush, we look at this and say, well, it's dominated by greens, so it must be a monochromatic color scheme. But when we look a bit closer at those greens, here we see a rather straightforward green, an even mix of blue and yellow, tinted with white to a lighter value. But then when we move inside the face, we see that the greens become warmer. There's yellow added to them, perhaps even little touches of orange in there too. Then there's the question of the use of black. Well, black isn't a color, black is a value, so maybe it doesn't really count. And then we look at the lips, where we see quite distinctly a bit of orange, maybe even leaning towards red as a pink. So because it's a painting that's dominated by at least greens, different greens, technically it's an analogous color scheme. Does that mean that we can't call it monochromatic? Not necessarily. It's monochromatic in the sense that it is dominated by green. It's analogous technically because they are different greens, but I think there's a decent argument to be made both ways. Probably the best analysis of a painting like this would be to explain the difference between these two and why it fits in this very narrow wiggle room between the two color schemes. The complementary color scheme is one of the most important. It utilizes colors, in this case red and green, that are on opposite sides of the wheel from each other. Remember that when red is placed next to green, they make each other appear more intense, brighter, more saturated. However, when they're mixed together, as they are here in the fan, they produce chromatic grays that are pleasing, are neutral, and work well within the rest of the scheme. This is a painting by someone you know, and it overtly uses a complementary color scheme because the red of the sky and the green of the dirt are directly opposite on the color wheel. Even though other colors, like the kind of blue-greens that appear here and in the palm foliage, and yellows and orange here and other neutrals appear in the painting, it's still predominantly characterized by the red and the green, therefore complementary color scheme. The split complementary scheme is similar to complementary. It's a variation, really. In this particular example, we have yellow. Its complementary here is purple or violet, but instead of using the strict complement, the artist would move off to the side to these adjacent colors, these tertiary colors, because they produce much the same effect as a complementary scheme, but toned down a little bit. These types of split complementary color scheme can be incredibly complex and sometimes defy being categorized. A case in point is the Portrait of Dr. Gachet, also by our buddy Vince. When we look at this painting, we see that it's characterized by a range of blues, maybe sneaking into purples a little teeny bit, and then there's green, and really more importantly, there's orange on the tablecloth below. There are complementary relationships in this painting. For instance, the oranges of the tablecloth to the blues here, here, and here. But there are also more complex relationships because these blues don't remain constant. Sometimes they become a little bit more purple. Sometimes they're muddied up even by adding a bit of black. And then there are definite purples right here in these flowers and down in here. In this work then, the color relationships vacillate a little bit between what we would call more of a straight complementary scheme to perhaps a split complementary scheme, very complex, difficult to categorize. The triadic color scheme is most often seen in what we call the primary triadic scheme, meaning it's built out of primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. Quite obviously, we see the yellow here, we see the blue here and here, we see red here in her bandana, but we also see red in the shadow areas and the skin tones, which lead to the red. In the previous example, when we looked at the primary triadic scheme, it was made of yellow, of blue, and red. Notice that this forms an equilateral triangle between the three different colors. We could easily make it out of the secondary colors, green, secondary, violet or purple, also a secondary, orange, a secondary. The shape of the triangle remains the same. We could shift another one and hit tertiary colors, so these relationships can become quite complex. This is a textbook example of the primary triadic color scheme by American artist Alexander Calder. Not too much more needs to be said about that. This example by Edward Hopper, a late painting, Rooms by the Sea, is a bit more controversial. We can see easily that we've got blues, different blues happening over here. We've got yellow. We've got yellow turning green by adding blue to it in the shadow. We've got kind of light gray blues here, warm gray, that's yellow added to it. And then here we have the fabric on this little settee that is quite bright red. There's our three ingredients, red, yellow, blue, for the primary triadic color scheme. Consider, though, with the painterly aspects of Hopper's work, that these color arrangements are not clear-cut, and the red only appears right here. So is it primary triadic scheme, or is that a stretch? I'm not really sure, but I'd love to listen to your argument one way or the other. A last color scheme, known as tonalism or tonalist color, does not appear in your book, strangely enough. There are many examples of tonalist paintings in art history, although it's perhaps characterized best by a late 19th century American movement in which value told most of the story and color was de-emphasized. This work by famous American landscape painter George Inness is a great example of tonalism. Notice that the colors are quite subdued. It's difficult to put names on these colors. They're very, very neutral colors mostly, complex mixes of more easy to identify colors. In fact, places that are easy to identify are maybe only the yellow that's flashing on the tree there and some of the bright colors of the flowers. So the painting itself is organized and defined more by value relationships, and neutral color rather than identifiable color. That's tonalism. Finally, after this long haul through the technical attributes of color, we get down to what's really important. How does color influence the work's content, its meaning? Our example here is the work of British-Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare. You see the designation behind his name, RA for his acceptance in the Royal Academy of Art, and CBE defined as the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, bestowed upon him by the Queen herself. Shonibare's work typically deals with colonialism and the intersection between various cultures. In Victorian Couple, he uses garments that display, well, Victorian garments of the time, the late 19th century. However, he's had these garments made out of fabrics that are decidedly un-Victorian. In fact, they reference brighter tribal garments that would have been more in keeping with his Nigerian heritage rather than his British citizenship. This is a detail from Shonibare's 2014 installation titled British Library. Like Victorian Couple, it juxtaposes traditional British elements, the wooden bookcases, the books lined up in neat even rows, with other elements that reflect perhaps his African heritage or world culture in general, and that would be the very, very bright, colorful, geometric book coverings. Each one of the spines of the book has a name on it. The name represents an individual human being. Some of them are legible in the slide. We see Nancy Ewan, Jerry Rafferty, musician. There's even Rupert Murdoch. Here's Tracy Emin, bad girl Tracy from Margate. This is Shonibare's way of placing interest on the individual, who may belong to one culture, the other, or perhaps a combination of those. This final slide, a work by Wang Guangyi, has only 3 colors in it: red, a kind of dirty yellow, and dirty yellow-green. There's also the values white and black. After spending a couple of moments looking at this piece, I think it's easy to understand that the use of color is complex, that it is definitely provocative and contradictory. In what ways? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you because, well, maybe you could answer that as a question on a quiz. All right, that's it for color. Thank you. Talk to you soon.